Hi guys. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, so we'll continue with where we left off. So we completed CIA triad, we understood how do you protect the confidentiality, integrity, and how do you basically provide availability of resources and how they are, why they are important. So next topic that we'll go over is, I'll go over some security best practices, cybersecurity best practices. Okay, just going over some of the main ones. Okay, the first one is conducting training and awareness. Again, this is again for your end user thing. Okay, so a strong cybersecurity strategy, basically it is only successful if your employees are educated, basically on the topic of cybersecurity. What are the different risks that they are at? Okay, what they should do to an email, to attachments, what should they not do to an email and attachment. Okay, make them aware of company infosec and cybersecurity policies. Okay, and if they have some sort of an incident, how they can report it. Okay, maybe they by accident clicked on a link and realized that it was something incorrect or bad. Okay, things of those nature. Okay. So like I've already explained previously, you could have the best technical defenses, okay, but if your employees, they make intentional or unintentional malicious actions, they can result in a very costly security breach. Okay, so educating employees and raising awareness of the company's policies and security best practices, you can do it through some sort of webinars, seminars, conduct online classes, maybe courses, or some video on demand type stuff that a lot of organizations implement. Okay, which kind of like is the best way to reduce that negligence and potential for a security violence. Okay. Next thing is to do a risk assessment for your environment. Okay, and it should not be a casual risk assessment, but a very formal and a very thorough risk assessment. Okay, and we'll be discussing risk assessment after a couple of slides as well in a much more detail. But it basically involves, first of all, identifying all of your valuable assets, right? What data, servers, PCs, anything, files, paperwork, whatever is valuable to the organization. And then prioritize them based on the impact that would cause if one of those assets, they kind of get compromised. Okay, so it will help the organization to budget and decide on how to best spend their resources on securing each of those valuable assets. Okay, so that's where your risk assessments come in, and they should typically be done every year. So everything related to cybersecurity is kind of periodic. Okay, you either do everything if there's a change in the network, maybe if you get something new in your network, you repeat some steps again, irrespective of time, irrespective of the fact how many times you have done that in the past as well. Okay. Next is, again, an important thing, vulnerability management and software patch management and updates. Okay, so it is very crucial for the IT teams to perform some sort of an identification, some sort of a classification, some sort of a mitigation of vulnerabilities within all the software basically the network is using. Okay, this helps to reduce the threat, and in turn it reduces the risk as well. Okay, and if organization is big enough, they can hire security researchers who can help identify new vulnerabilities within the various softwares every now and then you can proactively report those back to software vendors. Okay, which can also help you to mitigate or help protect against some zero-day attacks as well, or some zero-day vulnerabilities as well. Okay. And a lot of software vendors, be it anyone out there, they periodically release updates which patch and are meant to patch and mitigate vulnerabilities. So it's a very good practice, and it should be a practice that all the IT systems, be it anything, be it your firewalls, be it your identity management solutions, be it your Active Directory, be it anything else. If you're using on-prem Microsoft Office or something, you're using mail relay servers, anything, all of those should be kept up to date to help protect them against any sort of vulnerabilities. Next, another very important thing is principle of least privilege. Okay, it basically means that your personnel or your employees, okay, so both the software and the employees, they should be allocated the least amount of permissions necessary to perform their day-to-day jobs or day-to-day operations. Okay, this kind of helps to limit the damage. Maybe a user did something through a software or something, right? Maybe not intentionally, but unintentionally, a human error. Okay, so if you have not given him a lot of privileges, that would help limit the damage. Okay, and then if maybe there's a security breach through a user account, okay, and that user account is kind of locked down and it does not have admin rights, then it kind of limits and it will kind of make the attacker or the hacker work more hard to gain admin privileges on that account or through that system. Okay, so that's why a lot of time when you're using Linux devices, it's advised that you never perform anything through the root. Okay, if you have to do anything with the root, you basically do a sudo and then perform your operations, but never change your account to a root and then perform the operations, right? So there also your form, you are in a least privilege mode. Okay, so you cannot do a lot of damage. Okay. Also, within this, you can also factor in two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. Okay, your higher privilege accounts, your admin accounts, they should be locked down behind two-factor authentication. Okay, so that again, if someone tries to attack or gain access, they will have two defenses to breach before they can get into the admin access. Okay. Another important thing is to have secure password policies, both for storage and for the password creation, right? So a minimum of 12 to 14 characters is sufficient, okay? And it should be a mix of your lowercase, uppercase, special symbols, and numbers, okay? And you should configure the system to check for common dictionary-based passwords. Okay, so your users should never be able to set those passwords. They should never be able to repeat a password. Okay, so these are some of the policies that you can implement to have a more secure password policy. It also helps against brute force attacks or dictionary attacks. Okay, where someone can download maybe a dictionary database from the internet, put it into some sort of a brute force tool, something like Jack the Ripper, okay, and can brute force against your accounts, okay. And then you can also have account lockout policy on top of it to again help against brute force. If there are three or maybe 5 attempts to access an account and they are incorrect, you kind of maybe lock the account down. Okay, and then you as an administrator will have to go in and unlock that account. Okay, a lot of times organizations do not lock the account, but kind of disable it for some period of time. So let's say 3 incorrect passwords you enter or incorrect credentials, right? You enter 3 succession, you kind of disable the account for like next 1 hour. This also helps prevent or deter any sort of brute force attacks. Okay. And then storage is important as well. Okay. Should follow industry best practices of using strong hashing algorithms. Okay. If you're trying to store, so not using that MD5 or SHA-1, using SHA-2 to hash those passwords and save it. Okay. Because like I explained yesterday, hashing is a one-way function. So you take the passwords, you hash it, and then you store it. So no one can take the hash, run it through a hashing algorithm and get the password. They can't do that. Okay, because it's a one-way function. So you have to make sure that you are using strong hashing algorithm so that you don't fall into that hash collision kind of a thing. Okay, where 2 different passwords are producing the same hash value. Okay, and then also you could use salting. What is salting? If you've never heard about salting, so it's basically and Linux does use it. So you take a password, right? Let's say Cisco. You are basically going to run this through some sort of a hash algorithm, and you come up with a whole bunch of this kind of data, hash value. Okay. So what do you with salting? You basically add something to this value. Okay, and it can be anything. Okay, you either do it at the front or you do it to the back, or you can take the password, add some gibberish content here, and then run it through a SHA value, and then come up with a value. Okay, but typically it's done through this. Okay, so you take the password, you run through a hash algorithm. Okay, you come up with a value, and then within this value you add something additional. So this is a salt. You're adding something to that already produced hash value to get a completely random value again. Okay, so if someone is still able to guess this password, he can come up with this hash value, right? So if you take this, you open up a Linux machine, you use something like a SHA-SUM utility tool, and you can produce this value, but they won't be able to figure out this salt value that you added next to it. Okay, and when the system will get this as a whole, that will be the only time they'll be able to figure it out, what the actual credential is. Okay, so salting is a very common and a best practice kind of a thing. Linux systems use salting, okay, to kind of further manipulate the way that the hashes are being stored. Okay. Next is basically your business continuity and an incident response plan. Okay, so like I explained yesterday, no organization is kind of 100% secure. There would be times when you get some attacks, you get some breach. It could be minor, it could be major. Okay, you should have some sort of an incident response plan. Okay, you might need it for from a natural disaster, natural event kind of perspective. What happens if this server goes down? How we are going to react? What is going to be our business continuity plan? Do we have high availability? Do we have any backups that we can restore maybe in the next half an hour, maybe in the cloud or somewhere, and get back into business while we try to deal with whatever the issue is? Okay, if you're talking about incident response, do we have professionals who can stop that breach or maybe stop it from spreading, right? Figure it out, what is the issue, learn from those mistakes, do some trainings upon that, etc., etc. Okay, so there should be a solid BCIR plan and policies in place which can help the organization to effectively respond to these cyber attacks and to security breaches, while also ensuring that your critical business systems, they basically remain online and available for use. Okay. Performing periodic security reviews, important. You cannot just deploy security and call it a day. It is a continuous ongoing process that needs to be done. Okay, it's a very repetitive process, but it needs to be done. Okay, and security reviews can implement things like penetration testings for your network. If you are maybe a development organization doing source code reviews, design reviews, okay, running your red team and your blue team assessments, okay, continuously doing vulnerability scanning of your network. When there is a change, you introduce a new product, maybe you make changes to any configuration to policies, you do some sort of assessment, right? You run vulnerability scans across your network to see if you did not introduce any new problems, any new vulnerabilities because of you making any configuration changes. Okay, and once any security vulnerability is found, the organization should kind of prioritize and mitigate them as soon as possible. Maybe by restricting access, or maybe reaching out to the vendor and seeing if they have any hot fixes or any patches that they can provide for you to update your devices. Okay, and typically when you're talking about fixing the vulnerabilities, organizations typically they use some sort of a vulnerability scanner. Okay, they have a vulnerability management team. You could do something like with Nessus, Nexpose, right, Rapid7. Okay, and depending upon what sort of policy is, these devices can categorize the vulnerabilities into the top being critical, then high, and these are risks. There's medium, and then there's low. Okay, so your first priority should be critical risk vulnerabilities. They should be mitigated first. Okay, and they should be mitigated on a priority. You would then look into your high ones. Okay, a lot of organizations, they kind of don't bother with these two, because most of the time the low vulnerability and medium vulnerabilities, they are mostly just informational. Okay, they are low and medium in criticality because the way that those vulnerabilities can be exploited would be very low, depending upon how your environment is, right? Maybe there's a vulnerability that needs access, or that needs physical access to the device. Okay, critical vulnerabilities will be the ones that can be exploited remotely without someone being anywhere near a premises, or maybe not even within your premises. Okay, a lot of organizations still see medium vulnerabilities that should be resolved, and then they don't care about low. So it really just depends upon how and what your InfoSec policy really governs, and what sort of an organization you are, right? Maybe if you are a medical center, you know, or maybe you're part of PCI DSS, or maybe if you are somewhere in GDPR, you might need to take care of all of them. Okay, and have kind of like a completely vulnerability or a risk-free environment, right? So it kind of depends upon what sort of a policy your organization governs. Next is always have periodic backups of your data. Configuration, user, anything. especially your sensitive data. Okay, that will cause a lot of damage for your organization if it's either lost, compromised, or gets corrupted. Okay, and one of the things that ransomware does is to encrypt data. Okay, and in order to decrypt it, they basically ask for ransom. Okay, so if you have a backup, offline backups maybe, or somewhere in the cloud, protected, right? Even if you get hit with a ransomware, once you mitigate the risk, okay, you can remove those machines altogether, rebuild them, and then restore the data. That's the best defense kind of, or incident response that you can have against ransomware, which will not cost a lot of money to the organization as well. A lot of organizations, they don't do backups because again, it costs money. Okay, so the money that they save in not doing backups is basically lost, or maybe even 10 times if they kind of get hit with ransomware. Okay, they really don't have much to do rather than give some organizations a huge amount of money to help decrypt, okay, or give the attackers a ransom, which typically does not go well. So the saying is typically, if you get hit with a ransomware, don't pay the ransom. Because once you pay the ransom, there is hardly any guarantee that you will receive the decryption key. Again, because it's usually dealt in cryptocurrency, right? And you cannot really track the cryptocurrency. Okay, so once you give out the money, there's no way for you to track it down for the most part. Okay, so you're going to lose the money and your data as well. We already talked about this yesterday when we talked about confidentiality. You should use encryption for data at rest and for in transit. Software design. So I already mentioned SDLC yesterday. Right, that's the life cycle. So whenever someone is designing a software, even before the implementation of the coding stage, you design, security should always be the first thing. Whether you're designing a software, whether you're designing a network, whether you're designing a data center, be it anything, security should be the first thing. Okay. Yes, there is a cost when you add security measures, but it is going to be very helpful and it's going to save you a lot of headache and a lot of money loss down the road in the future if you unfortunately get hit with some sort of a security breach or malware. Okay, so security should always be the first thing. And the last bit also comes into the design software. Okay, but if you are in kind of like a development kind of an area, you do a lot of application development and the like, so you should make sure that there is for strong input validation. Okay, and this is the user who's inputting data. So let's say you are, maybe this is a login page. Okay, whatever you put in here, this basically becomes user login or user input. Your application should sanitize whatever the user input is and should validate it. Okay, so things like I should not allow things like maybe SQL queries to be run through this login form. Okay, things of those natures. So always and always sanitize whatever the user is going to input. So that basically comes under input validation. Okay, This is, again, this is a first line of defense against various types of injection attacks. One that I told you here, entering SQL queries, this is a SQLI or SQL injection attack. So if this web page allows a user to enter SQL queries, okay, a user can enter a SQL query and query the backend database and extract information. Okay, if the application is designed in a way to filter out anything except for A to Z, A to B, and 1 to 0, 1 to 9, 0. Okay, so a lot of times you would see web pages only allowing you these characters to be added and nothing else, right? So for SQL queries, you would need to enter colons, apostrophes, equal to signs, right? And then various other things. So you can sanitize whenever you see this. Okay, so protects against injection attacks. There are other types of injection attacks as well. One, there is SQL injection, there is cross-site scripting. Okay, so it's very important to do input validation. Okay, so softwares and your applications are basically designed to accept user input. Okay, so they should be able to filter out malicious input payloads. Another way to help you design or do secure coding is to follow OWASP. They are basically an open source organization who every 3 or 4 years, they come up with an OWASP top 10 list. And this is typically very helpful in case of application security. They list these top 10 attacks right now that if you are trying to develop a code and application, you can reference this and make sure you're catering to all of those vulnerabilities or attacks. Okay, let me bring that up. Okay, this is your website. So OWASP top 10. So 2021, they come up with a list. So as you can see, the first one is broken access control, cryptographic failures. The third most popular attack that happens against applications are injection attacks. Okay, things like cross-site scripting. Insecure design, security misconfigurations, vulnerable and outdated components. Okay, identification and authentication failures, things of these nature, right? Security logging and monitoring failures. A lot of applications don't do logging and monitoring properly. Okay, and if you open any of these, it will give you a more detailed about what some of the common access control vulnerabilities will include and how to prevent them. And they also give you attack scenarios. Okay, so this is very helpful for developers and for anyone who's dealing with something related to application security. Okay, and they kind of keep changing the list. So they came up with another list. So last list before this was in 2017. And they basically give you a comparison as well. What changed from 2017 to 2021? So how did the attack landscape basically changed? So for example, broken access control was at about 5th or 6th position in 2017, but now in 2021 or last year, it basically is the topmost one. Okay, and then some of these got added new. and some of those got removed, right? So the threat landscape keeps changing. So they kind of figured out that every 4 years would be kind of like a sweet spot. And then they also do other projects as well. So if you need to have some sort of a training against web applications, right? They have this OWASP juice shop. This is kind of like a vulnerable application virtual machine, which can be run in an environment, okay, a lockdown environment, and it replicates or it has vulnerabilities as you see in the OWASP top 10. So you can do trainings for your team, okay? For example, you pick a topic, let's say broken access control, and you can show how an application is vulnerable and how you can protect it through this vulnerable machine. Okay, so it basically gives you tons of these applications and content, and it also shows you what the architecture is, right? So it's kind of made up of a lot of different things that typically go into an application, right? So it has your database, usage of API, there is Angular being used, there's OAuth being used, there's API, whole bunch of stuff. Okay, so it's kind of like a good way to practice, even if you are trying to learn some of the things. Okay, it kind of gives you some challenges as well. For example, broken access control, these are all the challenges within that machine. Okay, if you are trying to do improper input validation, which I discussed right now, these are the challenges that you can figure out in that machine. Okay, and these are all of your common, this is your cross-site scripting. So the various types of cross-site scripting they have implemented. Okay, you have your reflected, your DOM-based. Okay, so this is kind of like a good practice against those vulnerabilities. OWASP Juice Shop, and this is open source. They are a non-profit organization, and they work quite proactively in the cybersecurity space. And then in addition to this, in addition to the OWASP, you should also be familiar with CVE. Okay, this is kind of like a database for your vulnerabilities, all the vulnerabilities out there. Okay, so you can search for any vulnerability. You can get more information about it. You need to add the CVE number. Okay. So there are currently about 180,000 CVEs in this database. Let's search it from here. Okay, so if I search for Log4j, I get a lot of these CVEs here. If I open any of this, it'll give me more information about it, right? So this one in particular is for Palo Alto networks. Okay, this is the year when this came out. It gives you a description, some references for it. Okay, so a good website to kind of do some research if you come across a new vulnerability. Okay, and in addition to this, if you're maybe in the US or something, you can also use the NVD, the National Vulnerability Database. It is obviously much better looking and everything, okay? And it can give you a lot more information about some of these things. This is maintained by NIST. Okay, this is an official website of the United States government. Okay, so this is maintained by the US government, and it gives a lot of different things. Okay, so a couple of things that you can see right off is this is the CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. Okay, we'll talk about what these mean later on. And then it shows some of the signatures here can be seen. Okay, so a couple of websites here that can be used if you're trying to do research on vulnerability, you want to understand, get more information. This information is very helpful here. Okay, so they basically give you both version 2 and version 3. So I'll discuss this later on, what both of these mean. And this is very important. So once you understand what this is, you can figure out how critical a particular vulnerability is. Okay, you don't even need to look at the base code. Okay. Okay. Let's talk about cybersecurity frameworks. So I've added some common ones. Okay, I won't discuss all of them in very detail. You don't really need to know them in very detail. Obviously, if maybe later on down the path, if you go into something like an auditing kind of a role, then yes, you will need to know it in very detail. And some of them, they offer auditor-based certifications as well. But for the purpose of the exam, you should just know, and just for general knowledge, what these are. And some of the more common ones, things like your MITRE ATT&CK framework and your GDPR and your HIPAA and your PCI, should know a little bit more about those. Okay. So some of the common ones, first one is your CIS, okay, or Center for Internet Security Control, right? They basically give out a very prescriptive approach, okay? And you would see a lot of cybersecurity professionals cite this framework, okay? The CIS control framework, it basically lists 20 mission critical controls that need to be implemented. Okay. And they divide it into 3 basic categories, right? Basic, foundational, and organizational. Basic, foundational, organizational. Okay. And then they also have some implementation groups. Group 1, group 2, group 3. Okay, so basically it's dependent on what sort of an organization it is. So if there is an organization which has limited resources and limited cybersecurity expertise, they group them into G1. If it is a super mature organization which has tons of resources and cybersecurity expertise, they put them into G3 group. Okay, and their controls typically are something like, so out of those 20 controls, so one of the controls is how you can utilize Active Directory properly. Okay, another control states how do you inventory, or how to do inventory and control of hardware assets. Okay, so these are, or this is the way that CIS kind of governs your implementation or your framework. Next in this list is COBIT. Okay, control objects for information technology. This is part of ISACA or ISACA, Information Systems Audit and Control Organization. Okay, they basically provide a governance system, or you could call it a governance framework. Okay, The way that COVID works is they do not cater to individual security controls. Okay, but their framework typically deals with or understands cybersecurity controls from the needs of the stakeholders. Okay, and they assign job-related responsibilities to each type of the security control. Okay, so in this one, like we saw, we are doing individual security controls, and a lot of others, we do individual security controls. It does not do individual security controls. Okay, some of the design principles that it has, or I should say the core models for the governance and management. So it goes something like this. A couple of them that I remember. One is EDM, which is basically evaluate, direct, and monitor. Then you have audit, planning, and organization. Audit or align, you could call it, right? And then you have BAI, build, acquire, and implement. Another one is MEA, monitor, evaluate, and assess. Okay, so all of these are catering to some form of what we are trying to do with cybersecurity. Okay, it kind of aims to streamline audits and have some sort of a continuous improvement. Okay. Next is the ISO 27001. This is a non-government organization, ISO. Okay. And this particular framework here, or this particular standard, is part of the ISO 27000 family. Okay. And this is a standard which aims for you to implement or helps you to set the foundation for building a ISMS, Information Security Management System. Okay, the best practices or the best practices that it governs, it basically is related to your leadership, planning, how will you support operation, how would you improve things. Okay, so ISO provides certifications for organizations. So if an organization is compliant with ISO 27001, they can certify that organization, or they can certify individuals as well. Okay, so you can get a 27001 ISO LA auditor certification, which is basically a lead auditor, which basically means that you are capable enough to audit an organization against ISO's standard. Okay. This is your MITRE ATT&CK. Okay, so MITRE is basically a non-profit, again, US based, and it's funded, or it's federally funded. Okay, what it helps to do is it defines TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. It basically states how an attacker, or what are the different tactics and techniques or procedures a cybersecurity attack will have or can have. Okay, that way it kind of puts them into categories, and a lot of products also use it. So if you see a particular tactic or technique being used, you can reference it through MITRE ATT&CK framework, basically. Okay, the CVE.org that I see, you see the CVE list. MITRE is responsible for establishing and trademarking that CVE list as well. Okay, this can serve as a baseline. between the offensive and the defensive researchers. So I believe they have about 14 TTPs that they reference, things like reconnaissance, privilege escalation, defense evasion, lateral movement, discovery, collection. So these are all the categories or the tactics. So within reconnaissance, they'll define what all really happens when there is some sort of a reconnaissance that is done by a threat actor. Okay, and they kind of have these categories for both Windows-based environments and also for mobile devices. Okay, so this is very useful in understanding how an attack can happen, what is kind of like a life cycle for an attack, right? Or what we call it as an anatomy of a breach. This is also defined in cyber kill chain. Okay, this was developed by, or this was presented by Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin is a US-based, very popular defense organization. So they have they build airplanes. Okay, if you ever heard about Lockheed Martin. So they have presented a cyber kill chain, which kind of defines what the first step is going to be when someone is trying to attack, which is typically your reconnaissance. What is the second step? Up until what happens till that attacker leaves the network. Okay, so this is a very good piece of information to not really memorize, but at least have a knowledge or an understanding. Okay, so this is how they kind of define it. So first step is your reconnaissance, basically harvesting any information you do weaponize, basically is preparing some sort of an exploit. Then the delivery, how is this exploit going to be delivered to the user? It can be through an email, web page, USB. If that user runs that, you basically go into the exploitation state, okay, where a vulnerability is exploited or the code is exploited on the victim's system. You then install the malware, and then you then control that victim system through, I already mentioned this previously, command and control, or C2C, command channel for remote manipulation of the victim. And then the final step. So this is the cyber kill chain. Okay, it helps you understand what really happens when someone tries to attack, right? So if someone is at the reconnaissance state, what defenses can you do? Okay, so what happens in reconnaissance? How can you protect your network from reconnaissance? If someone is trying to deliver exploit, what can you do to protect against that delivery phase, right? So for example, the email, what you can do, you can educate the users. Okay, you can disable USBs being used on corporate devices so that can't be used. Okay, do implement web filtering, content filtering. Okay, implement some sort of an IPS IDS solution so that any web-based traffic, if it might have malware, it can be inspected. Okay, and then if it gets exploited and you go into the installation phase, what can you do then? What sort of an incident response plan you have if an exploit happens? Okay, so these steps kind of not only help you understand the attacker's mindset, it also helps you to understand how you can protect or how you should protect each one of these phases and what you can do in each one of these phases. Okay, so that's basically the reason for this and for this MITRE ATT&CK. Okay. Next is your NIST. So this is kind of like similar. This is US based. US Homeland Security provides additional information about or additional guidelines. So it's typically used within the US for federal government, and a lot of organizations use it. You can use it elsewhere as well. There's no restrictions, but people elsewhere, they then try to use ISO 27001. Okay, I typically use NIST a lot. Okay, so let's say if I am trying to design some sort of an endpoint protection solution, I might go into NIST special publication and try to find endpoint. Okay, and from here, it will give me whatever the special publication is for that particular thing. Now, you don't need to memorize this, obviously, right? It's a big document, it's very dry, but it will help you look at or govern things, what really need to be done. Okay, so for example, what role with a configuration management platform or something like that do when you're trying to do endpoint protection? If you're trying to deploy firewall, if you're trying to deploy some sort of a, let's say, identity management solution, AAA solution, you can use these special publications to actually give you a guideline of what you need to be aware of. That's fine. You need to configure those devices. That's something that you can download the vendor's configuration guide and configure them, right? What about the best practices? How you can best deploy it to protect your network? Okay, again, all of these phases, they help. How can it protect, or what you can do on the firewall, or how you can place it on the network? How can you design it in the network so that it protects you against reconnaissance? How can you protect against web-based attacks? If a malware gets installed, how can it protect against that? Okay, and then depending upon that, you can choose what features and everything you need to configure. Configuration comes at a very last step, once you have properly designed your solution. Okay, so I kind of use NIST a lot. Okay, and we are free to use. Obviously, there's no restriction, right? It's just that you should know what basically NIST is trying to do. Okay, and everything within NIST is called a special publication. Okay, for example, this one here, this is for microservices-based application systems. Okay, to help you design, develop, and deploy large-scale application systems in both cloud and enterprise infrastructures. So it will give you a step-by-step kind of like a reference to, okay, you need to take care of this. Okay, if you're trying to do this, you need to take care of this. If you're trying to design, this is where, or this would be the most beneficial places to place your servers. This is what you need to care about when you're talking about some sort of a feature or some sort of a particular server, right? So very helpful. So that's what your NIST does. That's what your NIST is. Okay, so it's called CSF, Cybersecurity Framework, or I want to show this diagram. Okay, so this is the framework that kind of NIST defines. Okay, you first do an identification. And identification could be anything. What are your entry points for attack, different assets and everything, valuable assets? How do you protect them? If there are any ongoing attacks, how do you detect those attacks and stop them? If a breach happens, how do you respond? This is your incident response part. And once you have responded, what you can do to recover from that attack. Okay, do you have backups in place that you can restore? Okay, can you afford some sort of a downtime to take down the network and maybe stop any spread of attacks? And this is a continuous cycle. Okay, this keeps going on and on and on. Okay, that was your NIST. The next is PCI DSS. PCI DSS does not really do any certification or anything. Okay, it's basically, it was founded, I believe, back in 2005 and 2006. There was a lot of credit card fraud that was happening. Okay, so at that time, the PCI Council, PCI SSC, Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council, okay, they basically developed this standard, the PCI DSS, Data Security Standard. And this council basically comprises of 5 major credit card companies: your American Express, your JCB International, Discover, Visa, and MasterCard. This council is comprised of these 5 things. Okay, and they kind of give out a very good list of security compliance requirements for merchants, retail companies, financial service providers, banks, anyone who has to deal with anything related to credit cards. Okay, so I believe they kind of detail out 12 requirements, and I remember some of them. One of them is basically install and maintain a firewall configuration. So if you are a PCI DSS compliant, then you would have some sort of firewall in place. Okay, any devices that you are getting, you're not supposed to use vendor provided default configuration. Okay, encrypt all the credit card holder data, especially when the transmission is happening over open public networks. You have to have some sort of a malware protection solution. Okay, you need to restrict physical access to the cardholder's data. You need to regularly test your systems, security systems and processes. It also says anytime you make a change on any device within a network that handles the credit card holder's data, anytime, any change that happens to that part of the network, you need to do a complete vulnerability scanning of that network every single time. If you make changes 12 times a year to that part of the network, you do 12 different vulnerability scannings to make sure that that area and that network is free of, or you did not introduce any vulnerabilities when you made those changes. Okay, and any which ways, I believe it defines a quarterly scanning schedule. So you do it 4 times a week, 4 times a year. Okay, so these are some of the requirements that PCI DSS kind of governs to help with or to basically give a guideline to these organizations or institutes or service providers who are dealing with credit card information or credit card data. Okay, that's your PCI DSS. Next is your HIPAA. Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This is intended, and this was also one of the first national standards in the United States to basically protect patients' personal records. It is meant to protect PHI, protected health information. Okay, and I'll discuss one particular rule. So there are various different rules within HIPAA. You have got privacy rule, which defines something. You have got your security rule, which defines a lot of things. You've got enforcement rule. I'll talk about the privacy rules, basically. So the privacy rules are which kind of define the penalties, okay, that go with it. First thing is your PHI. Okay, PHI basically is all of the information. So this is everything PII, which is personal identifiable information for a person. It will be patient's name, his address, date of birth. In the US, you have SSNs or social security numbers, any biometric information of the patient. All of these, they qualify as a PHI. In addition to this, any past, present, or future physical or health condition, any care that is being provided by a healthcare system to an individual, whether done in the past, in the current, or whether it will be provided in the future. Okay. Any payments that those individuals have done towards those cares. Okay. Any information that on a reasonable basis can be used to identify a patient. All of that qualifies as PHI. Okay. Medical records, any lab tests, lab reports, hospital bills, all of these informations. Okay. So this privacy rule here, it governs some penalties, and penalties are typically related to any breach. Okay. Breach basically means the PHI information was leaked. Breach also means if any healthcare or medical information does not give the patients access to their own PHI information. For example, I am the individual, I request for my lab reports, I am denied that. That is a violation of HIPAA as well. Okay, and there are very hefty penalties under privacy rule. Okay, so first one is, it was an unknown mistake or unknown violation. Basically, unknowingly someone violated, it was not intentional. Okay, so the penalty for this is $100 per violation. And the maximum that can be charged under this is $25,000. Okay, so if a healthcare, a hospital, a clinic, or whatever repeats this violation, okay, they can be charged a maximum of $25,000 for repeat violations. Okay, if there is any reasonable cause, this penalty is increased to $1,000 per violation. And the maximum that can be charged under this is $100,000 for repeat violations. Okay. Third one is, I would say it would be neglect, on purpose neglect. Okay. But the violation was corrected by the concerned healthcare organization. In a particular time frame. Okay. For this, the penalty is $10,000 per violation. Okay. And annually, they can be charged a maximum of $250,000 for repeat violations. The last one is the same thing. It's neglect, but the violation was never corrected. Within a time frame. Okay. This has the maximum amount of penalty, $50,000 per violation. Okay. And a maximum of $1.5 million annual violation charge or annual violation penalty. Okay. In addition to these, if an individual intentionally obtains, right, he intentionally gets the PHI information or discloses the PHI information, that individual can be charged $50,000 and 1 year of prison time. Okay. And if someone does some sort of a false information or false pretenses and the privacy rule is violated under those false precedences or pretenses, the fine is $100,000 plus 10 years of prison. Okay, so they really take the PHI information very seriously. Okay, and anytime you are a government organization, sorry, not a government, a healthcare facility or a healthcare organization, you have to comply with HIPAA. There's kind of really no way around it. Okay. Next is GDPR, European Union GDPR, okay, General Data Protection Regulation. GDPR requirements, they are very strict if you are any organization, anyone doing business anywhere in any country within the European Union. You could be an organization in the United States, but if you have some sort of a business in the European Union, you basically are going to, and you would need to comply with GDPR. Okay, and what is GDPR? It is protection of consumer data and personal data. Okay, if you have to transfer the data across borders, there needs to be a standard for doing that. Okay, if you are doing any business in the European Union, you need to have, or you need to appoint some sort of a data protection officer that oversees that whole GDPR compliance thing. And there are penalties for this as well if you do not comply. Okay, and it's very strict, the GDPR compliances. Okay, So if a company does not safely handle consumer or personal data and there are breaches, the company will be fined 2% to 4% of their annual revenue. And this is going to be their global annual revenue, whatever their global annual revenue is. Or they can be charged either 10 million or 20 million euros, out of which, whichever is greater. If the annual turnover 2%, 4% is greater, then they'll have to pay that. Else they'll have to pay either 10 million or 20 million euros. Okay. Maybe if you have a website somewhere in the European Union, you need to comply with the GDPR standards. Okay. And a couple of examples were, so they are US based websites. One is Chicago Tribune. Another one is LA Times. They have been banned in the European Union. Why? Because they failed to comply with GDPR. Okay, so if your organization, if your business is present in the European Union and it collects any form of European users' data, you are bound to comply with GDPR. Okay, so this is one of the very stricter rules and compliances to follow. Okay, and I kind of wish that something like this happens for India as well, or in India as well, right? Where we have some sort of this standard where any sort of breach that happens for consumer data, it is kind of taken very seriously.
Which one we use in India?
It really depends. Okay. To be honest, we don't really do any of these things. So GDPR, we don't do HIPAA as well. Okay. We hardly care about the patient records and everything here. But yes, PCI DSS is followed by a lot of the banks and everything. So if anytime you go into any of the payment gateways, look somewhere on the web page when you're trying to do payment, it will mention something like PCI DSS compliant.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So they do that. And then a lot of organizations, they do follow COBIT. They do follow ISO 27001 as well. Okay. And then MITRE ATT&CK is followed up as well. But MITRE ATT&CK is not really kind of like a standard to implement. It's just your way to handle how do you design your network against protection. Okay. So those are some of the more common standards. There are a lot of other frameworks and standards as well, right? But these are some of the more common ones. These are some of the more common ones that you would probably see mostly being discussed, okay? And mostly being talked about. And you're going to see them also in a lot of other blogs. And if you follow or do some security research, you're gonna come across these keywords a lot. Okay, and in exams as well. Not just Cisco, if you do any other cybersecurity based exams as well. Okay. Okay, so next topic to discuss is these three things: assets, threats, and vulnerabilities, right? So what are assets, what are threats, and what are vulnerabilities? So again, assets is anything that you can put a value against. Data, devices, people. All of them can be categorized as assets. When you say cybersecurity, what you're trying to protect. You are trying to protect your assets. Okay, that's the whole premise of having all of these frameworks and all of these different sort of controls. You're trying to protect your assets. It could be your website, it could be your SQL database, it could be your network, it could be your wireless network, it could be your people. Okay. So people, property, and information. Okay, an asset is what we are trying to protect. Anything that can be assigned a value. That's basically an asset. Okay. Second is threat. Threat is something that you're trying to protect your asset from. Okay. It could be a natural disaster. It could be any sort of an outage. It could be a cyber attack. Okay. Anything that can exploit a vulnerability and obtain damage or destroy an asset. A threat is what we are trying to protect against. Okay. So I said anything that can exploit a vulnerability. Okay. So vulnerability can be anything, right? You basically forget to lock your door at home. It's basically a vulnerability, right? If someone tries to get in, a threat, he can exploit that vulnerability, which is what? The door not being locked. Okay. So a threat, or you are at a threat only if there is a vulnerability. If there is no vulnerability, but there is threat, there is no risk. Okay, taking for example from a network perspective, let's suppose I only use Linux systems in my network. Okay, currently my systems are patched and everything. I don't have any vulnerabilities. There is an ongoing ransomware in the world, for example, which affects Windows systems only. Okay, my entire network is not vulnerable to it, which means I am at zero risk. There is threat out there, but since I have no vulnerabilities, I have no risk. I don't need to fear about this threat. Okay, so both of these things, they kind of go hand in hand. You are only at risk, or your asset is only at risk if there is a vulnerability, because a threat can basically exploit a vulnerability. And it can be either intentionally or by accident. Okay, an end user, if he gets access to root, he can maybe delete a system file. Right, so the user is the threat. And vulnerability was that he got access to the root account. If he does not have access to root, but he's still able to log in the system, there's basically no threat. I mean, the threat is there, the user is there, but there's no vulnerability. Okay. Vulnerability is any weakness or gap in a security program that can be exploited by threats. Okay. So you're trying to protect an application, you have a lot of these fancy new gadgets and toys and your firewalls and everything, IPS and IDS. Okay, but if you have a vulnerability, in most cases it's the end user, maybe he's not educated enough and he likes to click on those email links, etc. Right, so that's a vulnerability. Okay, so it's basically a weakness in our protection efforts. A software having a defect, that's basically a vulnerability. Okay, a threat can basically exploit that and cause some sort of a damage to maybe the server or the computer, or maybe steal some data. which is again asset. Countermeasure, it's something that we either eliminate or we try to reduce the vulnerability. Okay, so countermeasure is a safeguard. So whatever steps that we saw previously when we talked about the best practice and everything, they're all countermeasures that we're trying to implement. Okay, that we're trying to safeguard against. Okay, it's very important to understand these little terminologies because they can get confusing, okay, of what they really are. They kind of sound the same. What is a threat? What is a vulnerability? But there's a significant difference between the two. Yes, they do rely on each other. Okay, but it's important to understand the terminology. So as you move on in your pursuit for security, maybe from certification perspective, a lot of times they're going to use these terminologies again and again and again. Okay, so it's very important to understand what each of these actually kind of mean and imply. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about risk. So I'll continue with risk. So I already talked very briefly about what risk is. Okay. So risk is any potential for a damage to an asset as a result of threat exploiting a vulnerability is known as a risk. So if there is a vulnerability and if there is a threat, there's a risk. If there is no vulnerability, so call it vulnerability, threat, and risk. So if there is a vulnerability, there is a threat, there's a risk. Okay. If there is a vulnerability, but there is no threat, there is no risk. Right? So I might have a vulnerability, but no one knows about it, or there are no attacks for it. There is no exploit for it. Basically, there is no threat. If there is no vulnerability, but there is still a threat, again, there is no risk. Okay, so that's how you kind of easily understand the kind of correlation between all these three. You are only at risk when there is a vulnerability and there is a threat for that vulnerability. If any of these components are a no, either there is no threat or there is no vulnerability, but there is threat, you will be basically have no risk. Okay, logically no risk, but real world, there is nothing like 100% risk-free environment. You cannot have 100% risk-free environment. Just like with any sort of security solution, you cannot have 100% protection. Okay, but your risk, or you need to be as close to zero risk as possible. That's what the whole premise of having security and cybersecurity implementation is. Okay, to have as close or to being as close to risk-free as possible. Okay, so risk is your asset plus threat plus vulnerability. Threats may exist, but if there are no vulnerabilities, there is little or no risk. Similarly, if you have yes for vulnerability, but no for threat, then basically no for risk. Okay, it's that simple without overcomplicating it and without over confusing it. Okay, and I've given an example here as well. So let's say if an organization patches the vulnerabilities for Log4j on all its systems, that organization or that risk no longer exists because the vulnerability that was Log4j has been eliminated. Okay, maybe there's a new vulnerability in a Windows system machine. Microsoft gives out a patch or rolls out a patch. You install that patch and you update all of your Windows 10 machines in your network. You basically are not at risk anymore for that vulnerability. Okay. Now, I explained this previously as well. It's very important for you to identify first your assets. What are your critical assets? What are your critical devices? What are the critical areas of the network? What are your critical areas of a building, maybe, right? What are your critical servers and PCs? How critical they are? And then you can prioritize and identify vulnerabilities, right? So maybe I have 10 Windows servers, which are very critical for my environment. Okay. I need to identify how vulnerable are these 10 Windows systems. Are all of them running the same operating system? Are they patched to the latest version? Is there any vulnerability open and not fixed in the current patch? All those things, okay? Have I implemented it? Or if I'm running that particular service on the server, which is vulnerable to that open vulnerability. If there is an open vulnerability that maybe affects SSH on a Windows server, but I'm not using SSH, or I don't have this service enabled, I'm not vulnerable. Okay, which basically means little to no risk. So first you identify your critical assets. And then you identify what vulnerabilities are affecting those critical assets. Okay. And this is a little diagram here. Okay. So when you're talking about risk, these are the two keywords that you would see being used a lot: likelihood and impact. Likelihood, you can think of this as a probability. Okay, what is the probability that a threat will be able to exploit a vulnerability? Okay, which will also govern whether I have any vulnerabilities or not and what security systems I have in place. Okay, and what is the impact? So if one of my systems, or if I have a low risk or a low probability, if I have a low probability, right? Not this. If I have a low probability and I have a low impact, I am at lowest risk. If I have a high probability, maybe I'm running log4j, okay, and I've not patched on all of my systems, that means I'm at high probability of getting an attack. And it also affects my web servers. And I am an e-commerce website. That means if this vulnerability is exploited, then I'll have the maximum impact on my network or for myself. So I have high impact. Then it means I am at a highest risk. Okay, so this kind of x-axis, y-axis kind of a graph, basically I've added here just for you to understand what the likelihood and the impact is. Okay, what it really means. Okay, so impact basically describes the damage that could be done. Okay, so what damage would be done if the log4j vulnerability running on my web server gets exploited? Okay, on my asset gets exploited. Okay. Risk management. You typically do assessments. Okay, depending upon your InfoSec policy, you might do assessments every quarter, half yearly, or maybe annually. Okay, depending upon how many critical assets you have and how critical those assets are. Okay. Now, risk is affects your CIA of your assets. And I've always said this, there is always going to be risk. You cannot have a risk-free environment. That's not possible. Okay, there will always be some risk, and your risk management helps you deal with that. Okay, you might not be at 100% risk, but you might be at 1% risk. So how can you even manage that 1% risk? Okay. Risk management allows you to identify, assess, and reduce the risk to an acceptable level. Recommended to carry out risk assessments regularly, periodically. Okay, like I said, it can be done quarterly, annually, semi-annually, depending upon your policies. Okay, there are two types of assessments that can be done: quantitative and qualitative. Okay, now quantitative is basically you putting a value. For each risk. Okay, so taking the same example, I have log4j not fixed on my main web server, Apache server, and I'm an e-commerce website. If this server goes down, let's say for half an hour, how much revenue will I lose? That's me putting up a value on my risk. That's a quantitative risk assessment. Okay. Qualitative risk assessment basically means I'm assigning a risk level, something that I showed you here on the previous slide. This here. This is your qualitative. Okay, we are assigning a level of risk to our network, to our environment, to our assets. Okay, so these are the two basic types of risk assessments. Quantitative, you put a value, basically dollars, some sort of money against your risk, right? So my servers are at risk, my environment is at risk, how much money will I lose, right? What's the value of these assets? And then qualitative is me just putting or categorizing my risks in my environment, right? So this is the highest risk, this is the medium risk, this is the lowest risk. Okay, so it's recommended to do both. Now, there are lots of different types of risks. Okay, there's a business risk, right? Obviously, anytime you do a business, you start a business, you are in that business, you have competition, you have competitors, you're always going to be at risk. Okay, this is something that you cannot avoid. Anytime you open up a business, you are at risk by default. Okay, there is data risk. What is data risk? Any corruption of data. Okay, someone steals your data. Correct. So all of this, it becomes part of data risk. Now, data corruption, data loss can be intentional or it can be accidental, right? It could come up due to some sort of a hard drive failure, maybe your storage array failure. Okay, that's your data loss, basically your data risk. You have your systems risk, right? Your servers, your devices, they are most likely to get lost or maybe damaged or maybe compromised due to an attack. Okay, so your systems are at risk as well. These are the ones that you do your business with, right? That you carry your business with. that are used to basically store your data. That is basically used by your employees to run the business. Okay. If you have any sort of maybe paperwork, right? You put them in cabinets and maybe store in some sort of basement or anything. Okay. If there's a flood or something, right? It can flood your basement and can affect those cabinets and those cupboards where you're storing that paperwork. That's also an example of systems risk. Okay, so anytime there is an inadequately protected network, it can be termed as, or it can be put into the category of systems risk. Okay. This I already discussed previously as well, insider threat. Okay, it's basically a threat from within your network, from one of your own employees or one of your own users. Okay, someone may be trying to steal confidential data. Someone might be intentionally trying to destroy systems or cause downtime. Right, someone who might have access, elevated access to your environment, to your servers, they can do a lot of potential damage. Right, maybe someone you fired during layoff or something, right? So these basically are called as rogue employees or disgruntled employees. Possibilities, right? So that's an insider threat. Application risk. Okay. Maybe you develop an application, maybe you use some sort of a financial accounting system that handles all the finance and accounts. It can be subjected to a failure, which might cause data risk and business risk as well. Okay, so that's your application risk, a risk that business applications will fail, causing some sort of a financial damage. Next is your third-party vendor risk. Okay, a lot of organizations nowadays, they outsource their business operations, right? Maybe support or anything else, right? Maybe HR, maybe support to third-party vendors or to fourth-party vendors. So the PII or the PHI data of my clients is now also being handled by a third-party or a fourth-party vendor. It will help my business to cut down the cost, but these vendors will now also have access to my organization's sensitive data. So I am at risk there as well, or my business is at risk, or my data risk is there as well. Okay, that's why a lot of time you hear the term third-party risk management. Okay, which is what it deals with, right? It enables the organizations to basically take advantage of the benefits, right, that some vendors can provide them this sort of a service without compromising on security, right? So so a lot of time when you're trying to outsource this business to a third party or a fourth party vendor, you have some sort of a compliance policies that this third party client needs to support when they're trying to handle your organization data. You run audits for them for your own money or on your own money, okay? Making sure that they are compliant with the policy. Okay, another one is lacking compliance measures. So a lot of compliance measures we already mentioned, like things like PCI DSS, HIPAA, GDPR, right? These are your data privacy frameworks. They are regulatory compliance standards, basically concerning or protecting the customer's data or the consumer's data. Okay, if some of these are not followed appropriately, it is a risk because you can be fined and you could serve jail time. Okay, and these compliance and these measures can also give organizations sufficient time to do to implement this in a way that they can pass audits, they can have an effective cybersecurity strategy, they can continuously monitor their entire network ecosystem, okay, for non-compliance. Okay, so developing or designing a cybersecurity network or an environment based on such standards, maybe NIST or anything, kind of gives you kind of like a more gradual and a more sustained deployment of cybersecurity, okay, cybersecurity features, meeting the compliance throughout the organization. And then doing that, you can then will be able to figure out through continuous monitoring which parts of your network do not meet or are not compliant. And then you can work towards evolving those parts of the network as well. Okay, so these are some of the many types or different types of risks that can be involved from an organization's perspective. Okay, well, I talked about all of this. Now, how do you manage risk? Okay, so there are various different ways in which risk management can be done. One of them is to accept the risk. Okay, so for example, I have maybe a part of my network that has just some non-used storage device and everything, which my employees use to dump maybe their own personal stuff, movies, etc., and those sort of things on the network. Do I really need to protect that part of the network, that isolated network? Are those servers valuable to me? No. Okay, so I can still accept some sort of risk into that part of the network, and adding the cost to protect that part of the network is not beneficial to me. Okay, so I can accept that current level of risk and compare it with any cost. What if that those servers that compromise? Sure, it does not have my business related stuff. It is not going to cause me a network outage. It is not going to cause me any sort of financial issues. So I can accept that risk. Okay, that's risk acceptance. You have risk avoidance. What can I do to avoid the risk? Okay, do I need to have the latest version of Windows 10 installed on all of my computers? Is it worth the risk? Obviously not, right? So I can avoid that risk by only installing tested Windows operating systems that have been tested by my own team. Okay, not always installing the latest or the greatest version that's coming out from vendor. It might be vulnerable to new vulnerabilities. Okay, so risk avoidance is either you take some measures, okay, to prevent the risk, or you do something which is less risky. Okay, maybe if you're trying to go out at night, right, you have two ways. One is a longer path, right, but is much safer. There is all sorts of street lights and everything. One is a shorter path or a shortcut, but again, it's very dark, there are no street lights, etc. Okay, so you can either do something, maybe take a flashlight or something and go through that shortest path, right? Or you can completely avoid the risk and take the longer path. Okay, so that's your risk avoidance strategy. Risk mitigation, again, all of these security controls and everything that we have been going through, right? Do this, do that, do encryption, protect CIA, do all of that. That's basically your ways to mitigate risk, to get them or to minimize the risk to such low levels that you can then accept whatever the remaining risk is. Next is a risk transfer. Okay, you buy insurances for your vehicle and everything. What you're trying to do, you're transferring the risk of financial loss. Who are you transferring the risk to? To a third-party insurance company. Okay, you're driving the vehicle, you are at a risk to damage the vehicle through maybe an accident or something, or a natural disaster. Right? Either you can take the risk, accept the risk if it's acceptable, right? That buying insurance will be much expensive than if I'll repair my device, maybe device or the vehicle. Okay, or you choose not to buy a car altogether. You are doing risk avoidance, right? Or even if you have to do that, you do some sort of risk mitigation. Maybe you only drive within the speed limits. Okay, you buy a vehicle which has sufficient amount of airbags. Okay, and then on top of that, you also buy an insurance so that if something happens, you are not fully at risk. Okay, whatever loss you will have, you will be compensated by the insurance company. Okay, so that's a risk transfer strategy. Last is residual risk. Any risk that still is left. Okay, so even after buying a car, driving within speed limits, I have the insurance and everything, there is still residual risk, right? I might be driving safely, but someone else might not be. There is still some risk. That's what's basically a residual risk. Even after doing everything, there is still a little bit of risk that is left. Okay, that gets placed into the category of residual risk. Okay, so that's your risk and risk management. Okay, and we can talk about risk management for as long as we can, right? But this is all that you should really be, you should really know at a sufficiently high level, at a little bit of more detail what these things are, right? If you've never previously gone over these things, and if these kind of always sounded a bit confusing, it should be now more clear when you're now talking about anything, even in real life. Okay, or maybe if you're trying to design or architect a solution, you can always take into consideration these things. Okay, it can help you design and architect a solution in a much better way. Okay, let's discuss CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. Okay, when I showed you that NVD and the CVE.org website, you see every single vulnerability score, it had a CVSS. Okay, again, this is an industry standard. Okay, all the devices should understand what CVSS is. You would see a lot of these CVSS from the perspective of your firewalls, from a perspective of your vulnerability scanners, right? Things like your Tenable Nessus or Nexpose, or maybe Rapid7. Okay, so CVSS, it gives a score between 0 and 10. Okay, and I already discussed this. The most severe vulnerability will be given a score of 10. Okay, 7 to 9 is usually high. I believe 3 to 4 or 4 to 6 is typically the medium, and then less than that, everything is low. Okay. First, so it's basically a non-profit organization that manages CVSS, first.org. You can go over to their website. You can look over it. They have a lot of good information about a lot of the changes, what every single field and everything within that CVSS means. Okay. And anyone can use it. You don't really need to be a member of this organization to basically utilize or implement it. Okay, so if I have a firewall product that I design and I want to sell in the market, I can use CVSS. I don't really need to get any permission or anything from this organization. Okay. So they basically consist of these three matrix groups. You have base matrix, and then you have temporal and environmental. And I'll go over these, what they actually mean. Okay. And I already showed you this, the NVD database. Okay, I think it was nvd.org, right? Again, maintained by the US government, right? Under NIST. I mean, it follows NIST. Okay. And these are the three main matrix groups. Using the values within these matrix groups, you basically get your final CVSS score or your base score. Okay, and again, this can range from a 0 to 10. So previously, we used to have CVSS version 2. Right now, as we saw on the NVD database, we have version 3. Version 2 is still being used, but we are slowly moving to version 3. Okay. It's at 3.1 currently. Okay. And basically in version 3, we added some more matrix to define how severe a particular vulnerability is, right? And I mentioned a couple of things. It basically added a section to define privileges required to exploit a vulnerability. When I say privileges, whether I can have just a regular local user account privilege to exploit a vulnerability, or I need to be an admin to exploit a vulnerability. Okay, typical times and a lot of times you need to be an admin to run some sort of a script or a code. Okay, so obviously this vulnerability, which will need admin access, will be less critical versus if I can exploit a vulnerability using just a regular user account. Okay. They also added another metric, which was attacker to propagate across systems, which they sent as scope. So after they exploited the vulnerability, can the attacker do a lateral movement, which basically means from one system to another, lateral movement, right? Horizontal movement, or they can only do, let's just call it vertical movement. On a system, they get access to local account, right? And can they escalate their privileges to become an admin? Basically, priv exec or privilege escalation. So after they exploit a vulnerability, can they move across the network from system to system? Can they hop from system to system? Or they can only be restricted on the network or on that particular system and can only do a vertical movement in that system itself. Okay, so they kind of defined it through this scope. So version 2 did not have these two variables to define how critical a vulnerability is. Version 3 added this. I mean, they added some more stuff, but these are the most notable ones. Okay, So I have mentioned a couple of things here in the base group. What are the changes that were made? Okay. So your vulnerabilities have these matrix or these parameters that are assigned. So let's say a vulnerability, let's say log4j. The vulnerability will define, or the CVSS will define, how severely does it affect CIA? Does it affect confidentiality? And they will score it. Maybe none. Which means that the data is still kept private even if the vulnerability is exploited. Let's say this vulnerability allows someone to change the data or modify the data. That means the integrity will be high. Availability. Can this vulnerability cause any disruption of service? Maybe it could. Put it as high. Okay. So likewise, there will be other parameters as well. Okay. So which we saw here, there'll be one for privileges. And it will mention whether to exploit this, someone needs to have admin privileges. So all of these vulnerabilities, they kind of work together in getting you that score, that base score. Okay. For example, within the base group, they added a physical value, which basically means whether a particular vulnerability can be accessed or can be exploited remotely, or someone needs to have physical access to a system. If for a vulnerability to be exploited, someone needs to have a physical access to a system, this vulnerability will be less critical. Okay, because not everyone or not every expert hacker will have access to your building, to your data center, where that server is placed. Okay, versus if the same vulnerability can be exploited remotely, that'll be more critical, right? Everyone can come in remotely into your network. Okay, another one here is user interaction. There are some vulnerabilities that only get exploited when a user clicks on something. Maybe he downloads an attachment, double clicks an exe file. That's when they execute. A lot of time you have some zero-touch vulnerabilities, which basically mean they do not need any user interaction to be exploited. Okay, so logically, these will be more critical. Okay, so this is what they added with the zero interaction, whether or not the cooperation of a user is needed to conduct a exploit. Okay, this is the privileges required here that I already explained. Okay, to indicate whether an administrator or other escalated privileges on the target machine must be achieved in order to successfully exploit the system. What privileges are required, whether I need to be admin or not. If I need to be admin, then it's less critical, right? Because then the attacker will need to work on getting that admin access as well, doing that privilege escalation. Okay. If it does not require admin and it can be done with a regular user account, then it's more critical, obviously, because if I log into a system, I get access as a local user. If I exploit a vulnerability, then that's easier for the hacker. He does not need to work more, or he does not need to work hard enough to get that escalation done. Okay. And then there is this environmental group that they added some more changes. And I'll explain this environmental group when we look at the various points. Okay. Now, the scoring system. So this is how CVSS2 used to do the scoring and put them into 3 categories. So 0 to 3.9, they used to categorize those vulnerabilities as 0. 4.0 to 6.9, they used to call it medium. And then anything from 7 up until 10, they used to call it high. Okay. CVSS 3, instead of doing 3, they're now doing 5 different qualitative severity ratings, right? You see the qualitative word used again. What was the qualitative? We putting a risk level, which is low, high, medium, those sort of things. Okay, so now we have none as 0. Then low is up to 3.9. Medium is 4.0 to 6.9. High is 7 to 8.9. And then 9 and 10 basically fall into that critical category. A lot of organizations will only worry about these 2 categories. Okay. Some more organizations will worry about these 3. And very few will worry about all 4. Okay. So these are typically going to be your very, very low risk kind of vulnerabilities. Okay. So here I have I've put in a study here on the topic, right? So this was done by Cisco. Okay, that what were the changes that were made between version 2 and version 3, and how did it got more vulnerabilities added to the database because of this change. So it's quite an extensive, quite a very very informative study that you can go over, and I would probably recommend going over it. Okay, so it covers a lot of different aspects, a lot of different informations. Okay, so it's a good idea to go over it just to understand and get a more good idea or a good picture around what this really is. Okay, move this here. Okay, so this is what, or these are all of the matrix that basically go into when you are getting that CVSS score. Okay, so your base matrix group has all of these matrix. You see your CIA here, the scope here. There's a user interaction, your privilege. I'll talk about these 2. Scope is here as well. Okay, these are 2 new ones. I mean, these are the 2 ones that I did not talk about. This is the temporal. What is the maturity of the exploit code? What is the remediation level? What is the report confidence? I'll go over these. You'll understand how they can help you to also understand things. And then you have some environmental matrix, and I'll talk about this as well. Okay, so first is this base group. So the first topic here is your attack vector. What does attack vector mean? It basically means how the vulnerability can be exploited. Okay, you would see this in the CVSS score as AV. So it can be network. Okay, it can be adjacent. Network basically means remote. It can be local. You need to be locally on the network. Then there is physical. Okay. So a remote vulnerability exploit will have a higher criticality. Versus if the vulnerability can be exploited physically. Okay, that means the physical access needs to be there. The next one here is attack complexity, whether the complexity of doing the attack is low or high. If the attack is highly complex, that will be less critical. If the attack is low complexity, then it will be more critical. Okay, and I've already discussed the privileges, the user interaction, scope and everything. I've already talked about the CIA, right? So whether confidentiality is affected, okay, and it will be none, high, or low. Similarly, if the integrity is affected, whether the availability is affected, if the vulnerability does a DOS, which basically means it causes the server or the device or the machine to reboot or shut down, then the availability will be marked as H, high. Okay. Coming to the temporal MITRE group, this again defines how mature or how good that exploit is. So I have log4j vulnerability. There would be an exploit for this. Some piece of code will or which can exploit this vulnerability. How mature is that exploit? So this can be undefined. No one knows about it. It could be unproven. There could be a POC for this. Okay. Or it could be functional exploit, or the maturity could be high. So if it's high, then it will be more critical. And then you move like so. More critical, less critical, even less critical, less critical, and then this will be the least critical. Okay. Remediation level basically means, can this vulnerability be remediated? It can be fixed. One option would be not defined, whether, so no one knows whether there is a remedy or not, which basically again makes the vulnerability more critical. If there is an official fix, if there is a temporary fix, if maybe there's a workaround. Okay, so you will see these marked as not defined will be X, temporary fix will be T, workaround will be W, official fix will be O, and then there will be an unavailable as well. Which will be marked as a U. Okay, the last bit here is the report confidence. Okay, how confident are you about the whole vulnerability? Again, this can be either not defined, it can be unknown, it can be reasonable, right? You are reasonably confident, or it's confirmed. If it's confirmed, then you get basically a higher score. Right? So all of these, they kind of work in kind of conjunction to give you that base score. Okay. Then finally, you have this environmental matrix group here. What this basically does is it basically allows an organization to modify the base CVSS score. So let's say for log4j, my base score for a vulnerability is, let's say maybe 8.0. Okay. Every organization is different. Okay. Every organization is different. Every organization's score should be different for a vulnerability. Maybe I have more lenient controls for remote access. Okay, so if a vulnerability is network, okay, this is organization 1. So I will have a base score of 8.0. There is an organization 2 for that same vulnerability. I do not give any network access to anyone. Just a hypothetical situation. Okay, so I only give local access. So for me, this vulnerability should not have an 8.0 score. It should be much lower because my attack vector is not remote. In my case, if on my network, if someone needs to exploit this vulnerability, they need to be on the network locally rather than being remote. So for my organization, Log4j's base score should be a lower value, maybe 6. So my network should not classify this as a high vulnerability. It should classify this as a medium vulnerability. That's what the environmental matrix allowed you to do. Every organization can set their own base score depending upon how some of the values they kind of interpret for their own organization or for their own network. Okay. So you have this modified base matrix. Okay. So for example, I have a server which is affected by Log4j, but it's air-gapped, which basically means no internet access. Okay, which basically means if this vulnerability can only be exploited remotely, then my network is at no risk, because no attacker can come into my network remotely because I have an air-gapped network. So in this case, this attack vector vulnerability will be less in my case for my environment only. Okay, so these environmental and these modified base matrix allow per organization to do that. Okay, let's take a look at a vulnerability and let's see some of these parameters that I mentioned here. Let me see if there is a vulnerability listed here. No, okay. So let's pull up a vulnerability. Okay, let's take this one, for example, which we have opened from the previous one. Okay, let's look at the CVSS version 3. And you can see all of these metrics here. Okay, the base score is 8.8. So again, what we learned from this AV is attack vector. L, which means local. Okay, so this is not a remote vulnerability. Next one is attack complexity. How complex attack needs to be. This is low complexity. Privileges required. They are low. User interaction, none. N. Okay. This is your confidentiality, integrity, availability. All of them are high, which means my complete CIA will be compromised. Okay, so looking at some of these parameters, it's low complexity. It does not need user interaction. That means without user interaction, it could be affected. It compromises CIA. That's why it has a high base score. If this attack vector would have been network as well. This would have been much higher, obviously. Okay, so if I come up here, okay, so all of this is listed here as well. Attack vector, local, complexity low, privileges required low, user interaction none, scope changed, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Okay, and this is for a log4j, Apache log4j. And if with this, if you compare CVSS version 2, you're going to see the difference. Right? So it only has attack vector, attack complexity. It used to have AU, which is called as authentication, whether authentication is required or not. None. Okay. And then they used to use some different naming for your CIA. Okay. Confidentiality, integrity, availability. So they mention here complete. That means complete compromise. With CVSS version 3, we changed it to be none, low, or high. And then we removed authentication. Instead of authentication, we basically added privileges required, user interaction. Okay, so looking at a vulnerability here, and let me show you a high vulnerability. Let's see. Let's find a high vulnerability. Critical. Let's look at this. Okay, let's take a look at this. This is a critical vulnerability, 9.8 base score. Okay. Attack vector, network. That's why it's a high vulnerability, because I can access or I can exploit this vulnerability remotely. And look at what the details say. Successful exploitation can lead to privilege escalation. So if someone is able to exploit this vulnerability, he can escalate its privileges on that particular server or that particular system. Complexity is low, easy. That means privilege escalation, none. User interaction, none. CIA, high. From our log4j vulnerability, what is one change? Basically remote. So if that log4j vulnerability that we were checking out, if it would have been a network vector, that would have had a much higher base score as well. Okay, you got the point on how you analyze a CVSS score. It's a very nice thing to understand this, so that you can just check the CVSS and see, okay, does this apply to my network or not? Any question with this? Okay, so go through it. Okay, look up a couple of vulnerabilities just randomly and try to see if you can see how those vulnerabilities are basically mentioned. Okay, and check both from the perspective of version 2 and from version 3 as well. Okay. Right, so that's your CVSS score matrix. Okay. Okay, any question? Yeah, I don't want to start the second module. We'll probably do it next week. But that's basically the end of module 1. So next week we will take a look at attack vectors. Okay, a lot of different types of attacks. The injection attacks I'll go over. Some of these we'll see some more detail into social engineering and those sort of things. Some MITM attacks, arc cache poisoning, and those sort of things. Rogue DHCP servers. Okay, so we will look at all the attack vectors or how the attacks actually happen.
Arun, which resources we can refer to, like books or and all?
Books. I'll probably make a list and I'll share it. Okay.
Or do you have the PDFs?
I'll share the PDF. Yes.
Oh.
I'll share the slide deck PDF. One book that you can probably refer or read. It's basically for a certification, but then you don't really need to do the certification, but at least get some more information about what we are discussing. It's basically CompTIA's Security Plus.
CompTIA Security Plus. Is there any author or?
Just get the latest version. I think it's at version 6 right now. Okay. Author, I'm forgetting the guy's name. So you basically want it for the SY0601. This is the newer version. And you can get this one as well from Mike Chappell. Okay. Or a much better read is this one, Daryl Gibson. Okay. So he writes very in a very fluid way. Okay. And it's not really boring as well. So if you look at the contents here, so a lot of it will be what we have been discussing, right? Things like your confidentiality, availability, your risk, what sort of controls you have. And then it has got a lot of different other things as well. From network technologies perspective, how do you secure your network, honeypots and everything, different types of attacks, wireless, those sort of things. How do you secure the hosts, endpoint security, how do you harden systems? So it's a very good read. This is your threat, vulnerability, and common attacks, different types of viruses and everything. We'll probably be discussing these as well, but yes, if you want to have some additional read, then this is a very good book to go through. It does cover a lot of what we have covered, risk management, those sort of things as well. Okay. So this one by Daryl Gibson. Make sure you get for the 601. You can also get for 501. That was the older certification. The 501. The content kind of should not have been changed much. Okay. You would still have the basic core things that relate to cybersecurity, information security already in there. Okay. So whichever you are able to find, grab that one, but don't go beyond 501. So you might find some 401 as well. Okay. But stay with either the 501 or the 601.
And will you be sharing these slides?
Yes, I'll do that. I'll do that today itself. So you should have it available in your student portal. Okay. Okay. Any other question?
So we are basically right now we are going to all the theoretical part. From when we can like deep dive into core technical stuff?
Maybe another weekend. So next weekend we should be able to get done with the attack vectors, and then either from next Sunday or from next weekend we should be able to get into the start with the technical stuff. Okay. Yes. All right, then let's call it a day, guys. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Then guys, bye-bye. Take care.